Some folks are born made to wave the flag. Ooh, the red, white, and blue. And when the band plays hail to the chief, ooh, they point the cannon at you. Yeah. It ain't me. It ain't me. I ain't no senator,
Well, this is chapter 27, New Frontiers, and I want to talk about a little bit about the Vietnam War and some of the controversy that surrounded that. First, we got to look back at how it all began in Vietnam and how we got involved. The leader there was Ho Chi Minh, and he was eventually a communist in 1945. France controlled Vietnam up until that time. It was one of their colonies, and France withdrew, eventually pulled out, and by the 1960s we came in there and took over. We helped put in power in the south part of Vietnam a fellow named Diem, D-I-E-M. He was Catholic, which was kind of a controversial thing for a Buddhist country, and never really had the full support of the people, never really had eventually the full support of the United States. And the biggest reason we got involved over there is because we were afraid that if South Vietnam fell to communism, if North Vietnam took over South Vietnam and it fell to communism, that Laos and Cambodia and the other Thailand and some of the other Southeast Asian countries that would also fall to communism. This was called the domino theory. So we went over there basically to stop communism. Some of the influences in the war, I think one of the bigger ones was the media. We had Jane Fonda, who was a outspoken critic, actress over here in the United States. Her father was Henry Fonda, actor from the 1930s and 40s. And Jane Fonda was, like you say, an outspoken critic of the war, as was many other people in Hollywood. We had some images like Buddhist monks who set themselves on fire to protest the war. We had the Napalm Girl, if you look it up on YouTube or on Google, a girl that there was napalm gas that was shot, and it ended up hitting her and burned the clothes off her body, the skin. She actually made a recovery, which is miraculous, and today she's living in Canada. And we had a prisoner who was shot in the head in front of a cameraman. So those kind of images really kind of turned America against the war. We have to, before Kennedy was really one of the presidents that got us into the war by sending 15,000 advisors. Before him, Eisenhower, but Eisenhower felt that we couldn't win the war unless we're, Eisenhower really had the idea that we probably shouldn't be there. Although we did send some soldiers under him. Kennedy felt that we couldn't win the war unless we won the hearts and minds of the people, which we never did. And in 1960, Kennedy would win a close election over Nixon. In fact, one of the closest elections in history. And then in 1963, as many of you know, Kennedy was swinging through Texas with plans to actually meet Vice President Johnson at his ranch in Johnson City here, and him and Johnson were both in Dallas at that time on November 22nd, 1963. And as he drove through downtown Dallas and turned onto Elm Street, he was shot by Lee Harvey Oswald. There was a fellow in the crowd, the last name was Zapruder, and if you look it up on the internet, Zapruder film, it's about a 25-second, give or take a few seconds, video of Kennedy being shot. He was the only one that had a video camera out that day, which tells you a lot about how technology's changed over time. And then the Warren Commission was set up to try to determine who was responsible and if they acted alone or not. And the answer they came up with, led by Supreme Court Justice Earl Warren, was that Lee Harvey Oswald did it and he acted alone. And of course, ever since that time, it's been controversial. Books have been written about it, movies have been written about it. And if you believe the Warren Commission, that's what happened. If you don't, that's certainly your right to your opinion, but it's one of those things that we may never know the answer. So with Kennedy dead, Johnson would take over and escalate the war. He got permission from Congress through the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution to basically send in troops without Congress's consent. We went from 82,000 soldiers to 500,000. Westmoreland, General Westmoreland, was the commander there, and he requested more soldiers. So within 2 years, we went from 1967 to 1969 to having, like I say, 500,000. It was a tough war to fight. Johnson was trying to fight a war on poverty at home called the Great Society, because many Americans were poor. And the Great Society had some drawbacks, because the Vietnam War took a lot of his resources, money and time. Fighting the war, like I say, was difficult. The North Vietnamese had tunnels that they dug, booby traps all over. We dropped Agent Orange from planes, which burned the leaves off the trees. And then we could see the enemy, and of course they could see us too. But we found out later that rubbing up against those trees caused cancer, and many veterans of the Vietnam War are now suffering from that. Then we had the Tet Offensive in 1968, when the North Vietnamese came across the border, surprised us, hit many cities in South Vietnam, including Saigon, the capital, and surprised us. And although we turned them back across the border eventually and got them out of South Vietnam, it really kind of looked to the United States like we may not be winning this war. The kill count was up, but did that mean we were winning the war? So we started becoming uncertain after the Tet Offensive. 1968 election rolls around. Johnson decides he doesn't want to run for re-election. The polls all pointed against him. So what you had was Nixon came back to run for president for the Republicans against Hubert Humphrey, who was Johnson's vice president, and Nixon won the election. And he promised peace with honor and to end the war. And he did. Unfortunately, it took 7 more years. 1968 was an awful year also, because we lost 2 great American leaders. One was Robert Kennedy, who was shot and killed in June of '68 before the election. Kennedy actually announced that he was going to run for the Democratic nomination, but was shot and killed by Sirhan Sirhan, who, by the way, as I make this video, is sitting in prison in California in a life sentence. Also, Martin Luther King was killed in April in Memphis, Tennessee by James Earl Ray. And, he was only 39 years old, and, of course, the civil rights movement lost a great leader of passive resistance at this time, and makes you wonder where would equality be had King lived? What would have happened with civil rights? The soldiers in the American soldiers in Vietnam often were under the microscope at a place called My Lai. Many unarmed civilians were killed over there, and word got back. Lieutenant Calley was the man in charge there. Last I heard, he was selling jewelry in a jewelry store in Atlanta, Georgia. But we eventually got to a point where we wanted to turn the war over to the Vietnamese, the South Vietnamese, and that would be called Vietnamization, and then pull out. As we expanded, though, into the war, we went into Cambodia, And there was some protest around college campuses because many of those kids were the ones that were going to be drafted. At Kent State in Ohio, there were 4 kids that were shot and killed by the National Guard. In fact, Neil Young wrote and sang a song about that called Ohio, an anti-war song.
10 soldiers and Nixon's coming. We're finally on our own. This summer I hear the drumming. Lord, dead in Ohio.
Well, by the time the war was over with, we lost 58,000 Americans dead and millions of North and South Vietnamese. And as soon as the war was over with and we withdrew, the South Vietnamese asked for money and military weapons to keep the war going, and President Ford was in by then, and him and Congress refused, and the North Vietnamese rolled across the border and took over South Vietnam. And today, there is no South Vietnam anymore. It's part of North Vietnam, and Vietnam is a communist country. What did we accomplish? Many people ask that question. 1972, Nixon would run for re-election against George McGovern, who promised an end to the war. McGovern lost this election. It wasn't even close. In fact, I think he only won 1 state. Nixon would eventually go on to visit China, first American president to do that. A couple questions to close with. One is some people went to Canada when they got drafted. Eventually, President Ford is going to pardon those guys. What should the punishment be? Should there have been a punishment when the war was over with for those guys that got drafted and didn't go to war and left the country? Second question has to do with the Kennedy assassination. Do you think Oswald did it? What makes you think he did? What makes you think he didn't? Was it a conspiracy? And lastly, the war led us to lack confidence in our government. At this time, you look at the confidence that we have in our government, it's nothing like it was before 1960. Things seem to start going downhill at that time. So, something to think about.